A father sits behind the judge's bench, his gavel heavy in his hand. Across the courtroom, his own son stands in handcuffs, charged with a crime that could send him to prison for life. The entire town is watching. The media is circling like vultures. And this judge must make an impossible choice between his love as a father and his duty to justice. What would you do? Would you recuse yourself? Would you find a way to save your child? Or would you do what Judge William Dwyer did in 1987? Something so shocking that it made headlines across America and changed how we think about justice forever. But here's what will blow your mind. This isn't just a story about a judge and his son. It's about a decision that tore a family apart, divided a community, and asked the ultimate question: can justice truly be blind, even when it's staring at your own flesh and blood? Stay with me, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about right, wrong, and the price of doing what's right. Let me take you back to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 1987. This is small-town America at its finest: white picket fences, Friday night football, and everyone knows everyone's business. At the center of this community stood Judge William Dwyer, a man who seemed to have it all figured out. Judge Dwyer wasn't just any judge. He was the judge in Cedar Rapids. For 15 years, he'd sat on that bench with a reputation that was absolutely spotless. Lawyers respected him, criminals feared him, and the community trusted him completely. He was known for being fair but firm, compassionate but uncompromising when it came to the law. But here's what made Judge Dwyer different from other judges: he genuinely believed that justice should be blind. Not just as a saying, but as a way of life. He'd grown up poor, worked his way through law school, and climbed every rung of the ladder through sheer determination and an unwavering moral compass. At home, William Dwyer was a devoted father to 3 children. His oldest son, Michael, was 24 years old and seemed to be following in his father's footsteps. Michael was smart, charming, and had just graduated from law school. The whole town expected him to become a lawyer, maybe even a judge like his dad someday. But Michael Dwyer had a secret, and that secret was about to destroy everything. You see, while Judge Dwyer was busy upholding justice in the courtroom, his son Michael was living a double life. By day, he was the perfect son, helping at his father's campaign events, volunteering at the local community center, even tutoring kids in math. But by night, Michael was involved in something that would have horrified his father. Michael had been struggling with gambling addiction since college. It started small, a few poker games with friends, some bets on football games. But by 1987, Michael owed over $50,000 to some very dangerous people. People who didn't care that his father was a judge. People who wanted their money back, no matter what it took. Here's where the story gets really dark. On the night of March 15, 1987, Michael made a decision that would change everything. Desperate and terrified, he decided to rob the First National Bank of Cedar Rapids. Not with a gun or a mask like in the movies. Michael was too smart for that. Instead, he used his knowledge of the law and his family connections to plan what he thought would be the perfect crime. Michael knew that his father's best friend, Robert Chen, was the bank's security director. He knew the bank's routines. He knew when the security guards changed shifts. And most importantly, he knew that everyone in town trusted the Dwyer name so completely that nobody would ever suspect him. But here's what Michael didn't know: his father had taught him too well about justice and consequences. Because when that bank robbery went wrong, when Michael was caught red-handed with $75,000 in cash, Judge Dwyer faced a choice that would define not just his career, but his entire life. The call came at 3 a.m. Chief of Police Margaret Torres, a woman who had worked closely with Judge Dwyer for over a decade, was on the other end of the line. Her voice was shaking as she delivered the news that would shatter the Dwyer family forever. "Bill," she said, using the judge's first name like she only did in the most serious situations. "I need you to sit down. We've arrested someone for the First National robbery. And Bill, it's Michael." Judge Dwyer later described that moment as feeling like the world had stopped spinning. Everything he believed about his family, about his son, about his own judgment as a father, it all came crashing down in that single phone call. But what happened next is what makes this story so incredible. Because most judges in this situation would have immediately recused themselves. They would have stepped aside, let another judge handle the case, and tried to save their son through the best lawyers money could buy. Judge William Dwyer did something different, something that shocked everyone who knew him. He made a decision that would cost him everything but would also prove that justice truly could be blind, even when it was looking at your own child. The next morning, as news of Michael's arrest spread through Cedar Rapids like wildfire, Judge Dwyer walked into his courthouse with his head held high. Court clerk Sarah Martinez later said she'd never seen the judge look so tired, so broken, but also so determined. And then Judge Dwyer did something that stunned everyone in that courtroom. Instead of recusing himself, instead of stepping aside like everyone expected, he announced that he would personally preside over his own son's trial. The gasps in that courtroom were audible. Lawyers looked at each other in disbelief. Court reporters stopped typing. Even the bailiff, who had worked with Judge Dwyer for 8 years, stared in shock. But Judge Dwyer wasn't finished. In a voice that was steady despite the tears in his eyes, he made a statement that would echo through legal history. Justice is not about family. It's not about friendship. It's not about who you know or who you love. Justice is about truth, consequences, and the law applying equally to everyone, rich or poor, friend or stranger, son or stranger. As Chapter 1 comes to a close, let me ask you this. Would you have the courage to do what Judge Dwyer was about to do? Could you put your own child on trial, knowing that your decision could send them to prison? Because what happens next will test everything you think you know about love, justice, and sacrifice. The news spread across Cedar Rapids like a prairie fire. Judge to try his own son. Within hours, every major news network in America was calling the courthouse. CNN, NBC, CBS, they all wanted to cover what was being called the most controversial trial in Iowa history. But here's what the media didn't understand, and what made this story even more incredible. Judge Dwyer wasn't just going through the motions. He was preparing to give his son the same fair trial he would give any defendant, which meant Michael could face up to 25 years in federal prison. The community was split right down the middle. Half the town admired Judge Dwyer's commitment to justice. The other half thought he was a monster for not protecting his own son. Coffee shops, barber shops, church congregations, everyone was talking about the Dwyer trial. Martha Henderson, who owned the local diner where Judge Dwyer ate lunch every Tuesday for 10 years, said something that captured what everyone was thinking. Bill Dwyer is either the most honorable man I've ever known, or he's lost his mind. I just can't figure out which one it is. The trial began on April 22, 1987. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. People were standing in the hallways, sitting on the steps outside, anything to get a glimpse of this unprecedented legal drama. Security had to be tripled because of all the media attention and the emotions running high in the community. When Judge Dwyer entered his courtroom that morning, wearing the same black robes he'd worn for 15 years, something was different. Court observers later said they'd never seen him look so focused, so determined, but also so heartbroken. This wasn't just any trial, this was a father sitting in judgment of his own son. Michael Dwyer sat at the defendant's table, represented by one of the best defense attorneys in Iowa, Patricia Goldman. She'd flown in from Des Moines specifically for this case, partly because of the media attention, but mostly because she couldn't believe what was happening. In her opening statement, Goldman made a plea that went straight to the heart. Your Honor, this young man is not just any defendant. He's your son. He's someone you taught to ride a bike, someone you helped with homework, someone you've loved unconditionally for 24 years. The law allows for recusal in cases of personal interest. No one would question your decision to step aside. But Judge Dwyer's response was swift and unwavering. Counselor, in this courtroom, there is no father and son. There is only a judge and a defendant. The law will be applied fairly and completely, regardless of any personal relationships. The prosecution was led by District Attorney James Morrison, a man who had worked with Judge Dwyer on dozens of cases over the years. Morrison later admitted that prosecuting Michael Dwyer, knowing his father was on the bench, was one of the hardest things he'd ever done professionally. But here's where the story gets really intense. Morrison didn't hold back. He presented evidence methodically and thoroughly. Bank security footage showing Michael entering and leaving the bank. Fingerprints on the vault door. The stolen money found in Michael's apartment. Testimony from witnesses who saw Michael near the bank that night. The evidence was overwhelming. Michael Dwyer had robbed that bank, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But what they were really watching wasn't just a robbery trial, they were watching a father's heart break in real time. During cross-examination, Judge Dwyer had to make ruling after ruling that went against his son's defense. When Goldman objected to certain evidence, Judge Dwyer sustained the prosecution's position. When she tried to introduce character witnesses to speak about Michael's good qualities, Judge Dwyer limited their testimony according to strict legal guidelines. With each ruling, you could see the pain in his eyes. But you could also see his unwavering commitment to the law he'd sworn to uphold. The most heartbreaking moment came when Michael himself took the stand. For the first time in the trial, father and son made direct eye contact. Michael's voice was shaking as he admitted his guilt. "Yes, Your Honor, I robbed the First National Bank. I was desperate, scared, and I made the worst decision of my life. I'm not asking for special treatment because of who my father is. I'm asking for the mercy that any judge might show to a first-time offender who cooperated fully with police." Judge Dwyer's response was barely above a whisper, but everyone in that silent courtroom heard every word. "The court acknowledges your confession and your cooperation. However, this court must consider not just your circumstances, but the impact of your actions on the community's trust in our legal system." The prosecution rested after 3 days. The defense rested after 2. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for: Judge Dwyer's verdict and sentencing. But here's what nobody expected. Before announcing his decision, Judge Dwyer did something unprecedented. He asked for a 24-hour recess to consider his ruling. That night, he went home to an empty house. His wife had taken their other children and gone to stay with her sister, unable to watch her husband potentially send their son to prison. Judge Dwyer spent that entire night in his study, surrounded by law books, precedent cases, and family photos. Neighbors reported seeing his lights on until dawn. What was going through his mind during those dark hours? Was he questioning his decision to preside over the trial? Was he looking for legal loopholes that might save his son? Or was he simply preparing himself for what he knew he had to do? The next morning, April 28, 1987, Judge William Dwyer walked into his courtroom for what would become the most important moment of his career. The moment that would define not just his legacy as a judge, but his identity as a man. As he prepared to deliver his verdict, the entire courtroom held its breath. What happens next will shock you, inspire you, and maybe even change how you think about justice forever. The courtroom on April 28th was so quiet you could hear people's heartbeats. Judge William Dwyer sat behind his bench, his gavel in his right hand, looking out at a courtroom filled with reporters, townspeople, and at the defendant's table, his own son Michael. What happened next would be talked about in law schools for decades to come. Judge Dwyer cleared his throat and began to speak in a voice that was steady but filled with emotion. "In the matter of the state of Iowa versus Michael James Dwyer, this court has carefully considered all evidence presented, all testimony given, and all legal precedents relevant to this case." He paused, and for just a moment, his eyes met his son's. Michael was crying silently, knowing that his fate was about to be decided by the man who had taught him how to throw a baseball, who had helped him with his first legal brief, who had been his hero his entire life. The defendant has pled guilty to armed robbery of a financial institution, a federal crime carrying a sentence of up to 25 years in federal prison. The prosecution has provided overwhelming evidence of guilt. The defendant has shown cooperation with law enforcement and has expressed genuine remorse. Everyone in the courtroom was hanging on every word. This wasn't just a sentencing, this was a father deciding his son's future. However, Judge Dwyer continued, his voice growing stronger, this court must also consider the broader implications of this case. Michael Dwyer didn't just rob a bank. He betrayed the trust of an entire community. He used his family name and connections to plan this crime. He exploited the very justice system that his father has served for 15 years. The words hit like physical blows. Michael's defense attorney, Patricia Goldman, later said she could see Michael physically recoil with each statement his father made. But Judge Dwyer wasn't finished. The court recognizes that some may question my decision to preside over this trial. Some may say that a father cannot objectively judge his son. To those people, I say this: justice is not about our relationships. It's not about our feelings. It's about holding everyone accountable to the same standard, regardless of who they are or who they know. Here's where the story takes an incredible turn, because what Judge Dwyer said next shocked everyone in that courtroom, including his own son. Michael James Dwyer, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after 8 years. You will also pay full restitution to First National Bank and perform 500 hours of community service upon your release. The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. 15 years. Judge Dwyer had sentenced his own son to 15 years in prison. But he wasn't done. Furthermore, this court wants it on record that this sentence was not given in spite of our family relationship, nor because of it. It was given because it represents justice according to the laws of Iowa and the United States. No more, no less. Michael collapsed into his chair, sobbing. His mother, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom against her husband's wishes, ran from the room crying. The media erupted into chaos, with reporters rushing to phones to call in the breaking news. But in the middle of all this chaos, something extraordinary happened. Judge Dwyer stood up from his bench, removed his robes, and for just a moment, became a father again. He walked over to his son, who was now being prepared to be taken into custody. With tears streaming down his face, Judge Dwyer hugged Michael tightly and whispered something in his ear that only Michael could hear. Years later, Michael would reveal what his father said in that moment: "I love you, son. I will always love you. But I love justice more, because without justice, love means nothing." The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Judge Dwyer received thousands of letters, half calling him a hero, half calling him a monster. Death threats came to his home. His wife filed for separation, taking their other 2 children with her. She couldn't understand how her husband could send their son to prison. The local newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, ran a front-page editorial titled, "The Judge Who Chose Justice Over Blood." It praised Judge Dwyer's courage but questioned whether any parent should have to make such a choice. But here's what the media missed, what the critics didn't understand, and what makes this story so powerful: Judge Dwyer's decision wasn't just about one trial. It was about something much bigger. 3 days after the sentencing, Judge Dwyer received a letter from Maria Santos, a single mother from Cedar Rapids whose own son had been sentenced by Judge Dwyer 2 years earlier for drug possession. The letter said simply, "Thank you for showing my family that justice really is blind. My son is in prison too, but now I know it's not because we're poor or because we don't have connections. It's because he broke the law, just like your son did." Over the following weeks, Judge Dwyer received hundreds of similar letters. From families who had felt that the justice system was rigged against them. From people who had lost faith in judges and lawyers in courtrooms. From citizens who finally believed that maybe, just maybe, justice really could be equal for everyone. But the price Judge Dwyer paid was enormous. His marriage ended in divorce. His relationship with his other children was strained for years. Many of his old friends stopped speaking to him. The man who had been the most respected figure in Cedar Rapids became the most controversial. Michael served 8 years and 3 months in federal prison. He was released on parole in 1996. And what happened when he got out, what he said about his father's decision, will blow your mind. Because the end of this story isn't what you think it is. It's not about a father who destroyed his family for the sake of justice. It's about something much more powerful, much more human, and much more hopeful than that. Michael Dwyer walked out of federal prison on September 15, 1996, after serving 8 years and 3 months of his 15-year sentence. He was 32 years old, and the world he entered was completely different from the one he'd left behind. His father was waiting for him at the prison gates. This moment, a father greeting the son he had sent to prison, was captured by a single photographer from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. The photo shows 2 men, both grayer and more weathered than they'd been 9 years earlier, embracing with tears streaming down their faces. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary: what Michael said to his father in that first conversation after his release. "Dad," Michael said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I need to tell you something I should have said 9 years ago. Thank you. Thank you for loving me enough to hold me accountable." Judge Dwyer, who had carried the weight of his decision for nearly a decade, broke down completely. Later, he would say that moment was worth every sleepless night, every lost friendship, every criticism he'd endured. But Michael's transformation wasn't just emotional, it was complete. In prison, he had earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree in social work through a correspondence program. He'd also started a program for inmates struggling with gambling addiction, helping dozens of prisoners deal with the same demons that had led him to rob that bank. Upon his release, Michael didn't try to hide from his past. Instead, he embraced it as his mission. He got a job with the Iowa Department of Corrections, working specifically with first-time offenders and inmates with addiction problems. Within 2 years, Michael had created a program called Second Chances that paired former inmates with community mentors. The program was so successful that it was adopted by correction departments in 12 other states. But here's the most incredible part of this story. In 1999, 3 years after his release, Michael applied to take the bar exam. Under Iowa law, people with felony convictions can petition to take the bar if they can demonstrate rehabilitation and good character. Guess who wrote one of Michael's recommendation letters? His father, Judge William Dwyer. In his letter, Judge Dwyer wrote, "Michael Dwyer committed a serious crime, and he paid the price that justice demanded. But more than that, he used his experience to become a better man and a servant to his community. If we believe in redemption, if we believe in second chances, then Michael Dwyer deserves the chance to practice law." Michael passed the bar exam on his first try. In 2000, he opened a small law practice in Cedar Rapids, specializing in defending people who couldn't afford expensive attorneys. He also continued his work with addiction counseling and prison reform. The father-son relationship that had been tested in the most extreme way possible was now stronger than ever. Judge Dwyer, now in his late 60s, would often refer cases to his son's practice when defendants needed compassionate but competent representation. In 2003, something happened that brought their story full circle. Michael was appointed to serve as a public defender in his father's courtroom for a case involving a young man who had robbed a convenience store to pay gambling debts. Watching his son argue passionately for mercy for another young man who had made similar mistakes, Judge Dwyer later said, was one of the proudest moments of his life. But the impact of Judge Dwyer's decision went far beyond his own family. Legal scholars began studying what became known as the Dwyer precedent, the idea that justice requires treating everyone equally, regardless of personal relationships. Law schools started teaching courses on judicial ethics using Judge Dwyer's case as an example. The story was featured in legal textbooks, ethics seminars, and judicial training programs across the country. More importantly, Judge Dwyer's decision changed how people in Cedar Rapids, and eventually across America, thought about justice and equality. Surveys conducted by the University of Iowa in 2005 showed that public trust in the judicial system had increased significantly in communities where the Dwyer story was well known. In 2007, 20 years after the trial that made him famous, Judge William Dwyer received the American Bar Association's highest honor for judicial service. In his acceptance speech, he said something that perfectly captured the lesson of his incredible story. Justice is not about being popular. It's not about making people happy. It's not even about being kind. Justice is about being fair, being consistent, and treating every person who stands before the law with equal dignity and equal accountability. Sometimes that means making the hardest decisions of your life. But that's exactly when justice matters most. Judge Dwyer retired in 2010 at the age of 73. His retirement party was attended by hundreds of people, including many whose lives had been touched by his commitment to equal justice. Michael gave a speech that night that left no dry eyes in the room. "My father didn't just sentence me to prison 23 years ago. He taught me that real love sometimes means letting the people you care about face the consequences of their actions. He taught me that integrity isn't about what you do when it's easy, It's about what you do when everything you care about is on the line. Today, Michael Dwyer is 59 years old and continues to practice law in Cedar Rapids. He's married, has 2 children, and has never placed another bet in his life. His addiction program has helped over 3,000 people recover from gambling problems. Judge William Dwyer, now 86, lives quietly in the same house where he spent that sleepless night in 1987, deciding whether to sentence his son to prison. He still gets letters from people around the world who have heard his story and have been inspired to make difficult but right decisions in their own lives. The final lesson of this incredible story isn't about judging or punishment or even justice in the legal sense. It's about something much more powerful. The idea that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to hold them accountable for their actions, even when it costs you everything. Sometimes real love means choosing what's right over what's easy. Sometimes it means sacrificing your own comfort for someone else's growth. And sometimes, just sometimes, it means sitting behind a judge's bench and having the courage to treat your own son exactly the same way you would treat anyone else. That's not just justice. That's love in its purest, most powerful form. And that's the true story of the judge who put his own son on trial.